who was Bruce Banner. So one of the things you're going to hear discussed later on is being in the Hulk mode versus being in the Bruce Banner mode. And I realized Bruce Banner was the peaceful, calm, level-headed person who was the Hulk until the buttons got pushed. When the buttons got pushed, all of a sudden Bruce Banner turned into the Hulk. And that's the key piece with this concept here is when I'm working with somebody or I'm in a situation, are they in the Hulk mode or are they in the Bruce Banner mode? And our goal is to help get them to the Bruce Banner mode because that's when they're workable. As long as they're in that Hulk mode, they have no ability to connect to the frontal lobe, to make decisions, to think rational, anything like that. It's just totally off the radar screen for them. So when working with youth, when they're in the Hulk mode, the idea is to bring them back to the Bruce Banner mode. So just wanted to say that because I know when I first heard this particular module, I was lost because I didn't really understand. I spent most of my time trying to figure out who's Bruce Banner. So just making sure that everybody's on the same page here. So let's start the slides now, if you would, Gail, and then we'll do an intro and we'll work in from there. Then
Sure.
Enjoy, take a lot of notes, and we'll talk to you on the other side of this.
So, and I'm just going to explain that our pictures will disappear until the end, but we are definitely still here, and you'll hear our voices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me get you back to the beginning here. Sorry. Try it again. Okay. Larry, can you give us a little introduction to the Way Out West Coalition?
All right. So Way Out West Coalition, we're a coalition in Buckeye to work to build a drug-free Buckeye. One of the things we found out with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, it leads to higher rates of addiction, substance use disorder, but also with diabetes, heart disease, a number of cancers, a number of different things, and basically premature death. So one of the thoughts is to let's work to educating people and helping them be aware of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and how they impact a person's brain, especially a child's brain when it's in that developmental stage. This is module 2. Go to our website, the wowcoalition.org website. You can find module 1 there and take that webinar. That'll give you an overview of all the stats, statistics, and ACEs and how those ACEs scores. The higher the score, the more apt that somebody is to get in those types of behaviors, but also the premature death. Our goal is to help kids do adolescence well by giving them the opportunity to grow up drug and alcohol and trauma-free. And that's the key. If we can get youth through the teenage years without using drugs or alcohol and being involved in major trauma, what happens is the chance of them being a successful adult are greatly increased. And that's the key piece here. So our job as adults is just get them to the, till they can get up to like 18, 19, 20, even 24 without getting into drugs and alcohol, and the chance of them crossing what we call that invisible line to addiction is greatly reduced. Actually, odds are like single-digit percentages as far as them actually crossing that invisible line and becoming addicted. Trauma plays into that. So the more trauma we can reduce or teach them a skill set to deal with those situations that happened before that they had no control over, the higher their chance of being highly successful in life, no matter what, because they'll have the resiliency and know how to bounce back from different adversities. So that's one of the things we want to do and work forward to. So Gail, take it away.
Okay, so I'm Gail Kazmierczak. I'm a clinical nurse specialist who has been trained in the ACEs education. And I am brought to you via some grant money that is focused on preventing substance use disorders and treatment of those disorders as well. So today in this second module, you're going to see Dr. Robert Roten, who comes to us from the Arizona Trauma Institute. He is presenting in a number of the videos that you'll see. And our goal here is to create an understanding of how childhood trauma increases risk behaviors and contributes to opioid use disorder, and how trauma affects both the care and treatment of individuals with substance use disorder. So we'll hear a little bit from Dr. Roten.
So welcome to this Module 2, which is a review of some of the science related to trauma, the ACE studies, and the impact it has on people that is often kind of problematic. One of the ideas that becomes incredibly important to understand is that as the body is functioning, we're having constant changes in chemistry and hormones in this body. And as those change in some significant ways, then what we find is that without our choice, without our volition, we also have changes in emotion, thinking, and behavior. And the reason that that's important, and let me underscore this really for you very well, is that the changes are related to changes in body chemistry and hormones. They aren't related to on-purpose volitional behavior. Now, when we start coming from this premise, let me make sure that I'm very clear. I am not saying people should ignore annoying behavior, but I am also saying that annoying behavior quite often is the absolutely physiologically correct response for a body whose emotion, a body whose chemical structure, hormonal structure is shifted. And that what we're seeing are not only completely correct, but they're predictable. Not seeing them would be a problem. So let me give you a really easy kind of example of this, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about all the chemistry involved. I'm going to take two basic biochemicals and talk about them. And these are there's completely reasonable responses. So let me just start with noradrenaline. If there's a large increase in our body of noradrenaline, we will experience a change in emotion, thinking, and behavior. The primary change with the large dose of noradrenaline is we are going to be angry, aggressive, and hostile. We're not angry and aggressive and hostile because we are choosing to. We're not angry and aggressive and hostile because we are, purpose-driven with this. We are angry, aggressive, and hostile because we've had a biochemistry change in our body. And aggression and anger and hostility are 100% correct responses to that change in the body. Now, the challenge is, what is a large increase? Because a large increase is going to be different for each person. And again, this has to do with your history of sensitization. People that have long histories of adversity, toxic stress, or trauma, their body is so well adapted to responding to this stuff that they don't need very much to get the same response as somebody that was raised in an optimal environment would have to have. So to give you a metaphor for this, if I'm raised in an optimal environment and I've had very few of these rapid changes in noradrenaline, then I may need a whole cup of this stuff to push me over the threshold of being angry and aggressive and hostile. But if I have quite a history of this in my life, I may only need a quarter teaspoon, and that's a large enough increase to push me over that threshold. Now, what we end up seeing is that people that operate differently than we do, when they move into that anger, aggressive, or hostile state, we always assume they're doing it on purpose, or they are, in some way we see them as volitional behavior. But when we shift into that, we often don't see it as volitional behavior. We realize that our system is out of control. But as we see them do it, quite often what we're doing is blaming and shaming and labeling, and because it annoys us. And here's a really important thing to get a handle on. Annoyance does not equal illness. Annoyance does not equal mental health problems. Annoyance does not mean an educational problem. Annoyance is our emotional reaction to the behavior, emotions, or thinking of another that may be responding as their body is designed to respond. So we need to be really careful that we're not over assigning meaning to what we see. In the same instance, we have, if there's a large increase in adrenaline, then we're likely to experience fear. We're going to want to withdraw or get away, fly away, and puts us at risk for a number of other things. But a large increase in adrenaline, those are completely correct responses. Having difficulty focusing, having difficulty sleeping, having difficulty following through on anything. Those are, with a large increase of adrenaline, those are all common. They are not wrong behavior. They're not mental illness. They're not being done purposively. They are done simply because we've had this large increase in biochemicals of hormones in the system. The problem that we have societally is that we look at things that annoy us or demand our attention when we don't want to give it to something, or it requires more of us than a quick fix. What we end up doing is, rather than moving into an avenue of being able to calm somebody down and help them and help address this arousal, what we do instead is try to move into control, to manipulation, to punishment, to reactivity, to shaming and blaming, as an effort to make that behavior that we find annoying go away. However, if the behavior is there because it's biologically appropriate to be there, then all we are doing is basically stripping the self-worth of somebody away from them. So why is this an important point? Because the state of the body influences our emotions, thinking, and behavior. You all know this is true. Those of you that have normally are just wonderful and warm and caring people and almost angelic in a relationship, if you don't feel well, or you have allergies, or you haven't slept for a couple of days very well, how many of you realize you're just not as cherubic as you normally are? That is because your body and the state of the body always influences behavior, emotion, and thinking. Unfortunately, we can't understand by looking at somebody what's going on in their body. So what we end up being left with is we react to the behaviors and emotions that we see that are annoying. And when we see that their thinking is corrupt because of what's going on in their own system, we want them to think more clearly and to think more intentionally, but that is not what they have access to right now. So the question always becomes, what about the environments people are in? What about the homes that the kids are being raised in? What about the work environments where people work? What about the community experience? What is going on that continually is provoking this body into this state of change? And as the body changes, absolutely, you will see changes in behavior, emotion, and thinking. So what we try to help people understand is, if they've had a history of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity, or they've had high ACE scores, in other words, a lot of the things that we see are absolutely correct, yet they're interfering with the person's life. they're interfering with the life of people around them. But it isn't wrong behavior. It isn't wrong thinking. It isn't wrong emotions. It is just the right thing that the body does. This is the way the body operates. And what we have got to do a better job of is understanding that people that have these high ACE scores are often going to be engaging in things we find annoying. And the question isn't about what are they doing that's annoying me. The question is really about what's going on in their system that is keeping this kind of emotion, thinking, and behavior alive. And that's what needs to be addressed.
So a little discussion here. What is your understanding then about what Dr. Roten is saying? And do you agree with him that this would, for society, be a bit of a perspective shift, a change in the way that people look upon these behaviors that we see in society?
I know for myself, when looking at different, I was at a traveling across town one day. This is years ago, and I was working in a school, and I left the school, and I was working in another area there. But for years, I had heard from teachers about these bad kids, a bad kid, bad kid. So for years, I would always look for the bad kid. Okay, who is the bad kid? And I never found one. And they say, oh, yeah, it's a bad kid. You know, I'd still keep looking because I'd always see something good in everybody. And so I finally found that kid. And it was like, oh, I was so excited. I remember laying in bed one night saying to my wife, you know, I've been looking for years. I've been hearing about the bad kid, the bad kid, the bad kid. And I finally found one. And it was actually, I was happy that I finally had found the bad kid they were always talking about. And so I'm traveling across town. I've stopped to see a principal friend of mine, and he was doing some discipline with somebody in his office. So I sat out there in the waiting room, and all of a sudden I get the tap on the shoulder, and he goes, Mr. T, you remember me? And I look over, and I'm going, oh my God, it's, you know, in my thinking, it's the bad kid. But he sits there and he says, hey, this is what's been going on with me, because he actually left school, and then he finally came back, is what I found out. But he told me about all the things we had worked on, which is around a lot of this trauma. And he said, this happened, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing. And all of a sudden, my theory of the bad kid left again. So I still haven't found a bad kid. It's about the annoyance and some of the behaviors. And I found there's always a reason that happens. There's something in there that triggers it, something that hits that button that causes that to happen. And in working, if I can help someone realize at a younger age about what the triggers are, then they have a greater chance of not getting locked into those habits and behaviors and creating trauma over and over and over for decades throughout their whole entire life.
Oh, I love that example, Larry. Thank you. That is exactly it. So it's not about shaming, blaming, and punishing. It's about these are behaviors I'm seeing, and I know that there is reason behind these behaviors that I'm seeing. And what can I do differently to try to help the situation?
And that's one of the key things. My go-to piece is, you know, okay, if I shame, blame, and punish, that's the normal go-to, because it's going to make my world okay rather than me helping that individual. So it's important for me to be in the mindset of understanding, okay, how can I move this person forward? And it's like in schools, to develop a mindfulness room where students can go to, so they can start to, what we'll talk about later, would be get into the Bruce Banner mode rather than the Hulk mode.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's hear a little bit more now about his concepts 4, 5, and 6.
So in our mindset, particularly in the mental health world, what we have done is associated trauma with an event. And that's really problematic for us, because trauma is really about a physiological response, not an event. We've had people that have all sorts of really bad, awful things happen to them that never develop the responses of an aroused body. That isn't because they don't feel those things. It is because for them, they were able to manage through and not be overwhelmed by these experiences. So when we start thinking of trauma as something, a single thing or several single things that happen, or in events that happen to us, we're really missing the point. Because there's lots of things that are not battery, there's lots of things that are not torture or child abuse that a child in particular will experience that can elevate that level of arousal to generate traumatic symptoms. And so part of understanding this is realizing it's really about the physiology and not about the individual experiences. Some experiences all by themselves can create a significant amount of change in the body. But we also have situations where that's not the case, but we still are seeing the symptoms. And that we have to understand that it's really not about the event, it's about how the body moves into that arousal system. So when the body is in balance, and this is kind of my easy way of thinking about it, when the body's in balance, we have access to the full range of our human capacity, our human potential. We have the ability to think and to be able to problem solve and to move forward and to have goals and to be effective, to learn and to gain experiences by being able to be self-reflective and self-evaluating. That's when we have that well-regulated, kind of balanced central nervous system. But there's lots of things in life that push that system out of balance. There's physical things that push it out of balance. There's emotional things that put it out of balance. There's safety concerns that push it out of balance. And when it moves out of balance, it's designed to be self-correcting. And the way it self-corrects is either adapts or mitigates. What we are proposing to you is that symptoms result from the overuse of the body's adaption and mitigation system when the body is experiencing stress or threat responses. And so what happens is they become kind of overutilized, and that becomes kind of problematic for us. So let me give you a really easy example of this. The body has a natural way of doing this. You've all had a paper cut at least sometime in your life. And one of the things you're going to notice when you have that paper cut is, it'll probably bleed a little bit, but it's, not a big deal. An hour later, though, it's more tender to the touch than it was when you first did it. And then several days go by and you can still see where it is, but it's not tender anymore. And then, if a month or so goes by, you don't even see where it was anymore. That's a natural adaptive process. Think of the same thing that happens when you whack your shin and get a nice bruise on it. The body moves into an adaptive process to help move the body through that activity. The other thing that the body does is create the ability, we call it mitigation, is the ability to create space between what the body is feeling and experiencing and the body's awareness of what they're experiencing. Mitigation is really a process of that space creating. So we all do it. It's part of being a human being. In the world of mental health, quite often, it has been pathologized. When people do this, we say, oh, they're disassociative, or they depersonalize, and we have a lot of really negative labels for it. But essentially, everyone uses this process of creating space. And it doesn't require a lot of distress before we use it. Let me give you an easy example. Think of somebody in your life that loves something you couldn't care less about. And they just love it. And they want to talk to you about it every time they see you. Have those people in your life? Now, what happens when they launch into telling you about this thing that is just so important to them? And if it's not of value to you, what do? Now, we can call it all sorts of things, but you check out, you take a mental vacation, you create space, you're thinking about something else. Essentially what you've done is mitigated. Listening to them when you aren't interested is a distressing process. The little bit of distress that's there has caused you to shift into focusing your attention on something else, or thinking about something else, doing anything but having to focus on what they're talking about. That is a form of that is a form of mitigation. Now, it's also a form of dissociation, and it's completely normal. Now, if we use this dissociation too much, then what ends up happening is we keep doing more of it to find safety. Think of it this way. My friend talking about the fact of what they love and I don't care for it, you know, I only have to move this far to get freedom from having to deal with that. But if it was something really different, I might have to create a whole lot more space. So if I have a history of being sexually abused, I may need a bit bigger space. If I have a history of being physically assaulted, I may need a bigger space. If I have a history of just tremendous family dysfunction, where I have unpredictable, highly emotional parents, I may need a bigger space. I hope that concept makes sense, that it is really about that we create space until we get relief. And if we don't get relief, we make a bigger space. Now, the ultimate of that is when people get to the point where they have developed an entire lack of awareness of themselves, or they become depersonalized. They're completely disconnected from themselves. We see that as pathology in the mental health world, but the reality is that's what it took for them to feel safe or to get through this environment. And when you understand that, the question isn't about why are they doing this, it is about what's going on that's keeping this system so aroused that it isn't safe for them to be any more connected than they are. We are often dealing with people that have high ACE scores that have a whole history of adversity, toxic stress, and traumatic experience. And they have psychological, emotional, physical pain histories that they are trying to create space around. Sometimes they create space by engaging in irritating behavior. They're aggressive, they bully, they're angry, you know, they are unfriendly, and that kind of backs people off and creates some space. But we also have the people that just can't tolerate, and they are really good at mitigating. What do? Well, you know, what would you do? How many of you you have a bad headache, how many of you have taken an aspirin or an Excedrin or two? You understand that the Excedrin does not do anything to change the nervous system's perception of the actual physical pain. In other words, the nerve endings that are generating the pain are still going. What is not happening is that you are less aware now. There's been a block, if you will, put between the pain you're experiencing and your perception of it. Same thing is true when people have a toothache and they go get Ambusol and put it on the tooth. Well, it hurts again in a little while because you've never really addressed the underlying cause of the pain. All you've done is created space between your perception of it and the pain. Well, think of what people are doing. When we come from this perspective of understanding that the body and human beings in general tend to mitigate when in pain, when they're in distress, when they have histories of being in toxic stress environments, when they have histories of adversity, and when they have a lot of trauma experiences. In other words, they have high ACE scores, they're likely to mitigate. Why is that problematic for us? It's because it makes them more likely to engage in all sorts of compulsive behaviors, to distract themselves, to create space. If you think about the current opioid crisis that we have in the United States, why would somebody want a narcotic like an opiate? Because it deadens your experience. It is one of the most efficient space creating activity somebody can do. Now, is it life-threatening? Of course. Is it life-interfering? You bet. Is it illegal? Of course. However, the biology in a state of arousal isn't operating in a cognitively sound way. It's just wanting to have relief. Just like you, when your tooth hurts really badly, you are not thinking about the moral value of putting Ambusol on it. And it will really take us a long ways if we can quit putting value judgments on people because of their use history and understand that most of them that are using have histories of toxic stress, adversity, and traumatic experience. And they're trying to create freedom from the pain in all different ways that has been created. So why is this an important point for us? We are often missing the point when people have histories of toxic stress, adversity, and trauma. They are acting out or adapting, or they're making space, mitigating, and these are absolutely correct behaviors if their systems are still being overwhelmed.
So Dr. Roden here is talking about not focusing on specific trauma events that may have occurred in individuals' lives, but the fact that prolonged toxic stress can then lead people to mitigating behaviors such as substance use, opioid abuse, and that's biologically correct. It makes sense from the perspective of the physiology of the body, and that the individual is seeking relief from distress. Is that making sense? And any other discussion on that?
I know the substance use piece, that this becomes, in other words, a lot of times kids are experimenting with substances, alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, things like that. And one of the important things, and this is long before they cross that invisible line to addiction, one of the important things is when they use, all of a sudden they feel good, they feel better. It took something away. And in doing that, that's a real hook, because all of a sudden it deadens the emotional pain. It, deadens the psychological impact, because they finally, for the first time in their life, they felt good. And so
right.
that is a key factor with that. And when talking about opioids, an opioid is an antidepressant also. It's not marketed for that. However, it used to be prescribed for an antidepressant. And the thing is, it works, it eliminates pain, but it's highly addictive. So those are a couple key factors. But another piece that happens too is, food sometimes, in certain food, comfort foods, all of these things are behaviors that keep me out of my feelings and keep me locked in, that I don't have to feel, I don't have to do that. The other thing is space. Another one would be isolation. So there's a number of things that happen when I'm acting out in school and I'm constantly getting in trouble. Those are behaviors that, okay, what is the underlying piece that causes that behavior to need that space to defend or to push people away, or to attack people? Again, it's all in our perspective. So one of the things that I've learned is when I can help somebody become self-aware, and depending on your position, because sometimes, like with your family members and stuff, you can't do that. It just doesn't work out. But if I'm, say, in an educational setting, I'm seen more as a person who is there to create self-awareness or to help somebody, or to befriend somebody, and that's when you can make a lot more progress. So it may take other people in someone's life to be that key person that makes that difference. Somebody who's outside of their normal reality as far as their primary residence or things like that, and it just takes that person to be able to help that person have self-growth, self-reflection, self-evaluation. And one of the ways to do this and become very, very good at it is to do it yourself. If you've been through the process yourself first and you start to look at yourself, become self-aware, do your self-growth, self-reflective, self-evaluating, and that becomes like part of your normal habit behavior, then you're very effective when you go to work with others, especially youth in this area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. Any other comments? Okay, moving on to concepts 7, 8, and 9.
Here's what you're going to see. The people are going to be immediate, all about this moment in time, no future orientation. Very difficult for them to ever think past this point or this activity. They're going to be impulsive. They're going to be irrational. They're going to be illogical. Two are really important. When people move into this state of arousal, they cannot do self-reflection or self-evaluation very well, and they don't have much of an ability to evaluate a reward system. So think about that. Move into this aroused state. What should you see? You should see people that have no delayed gratification. They want everything done right now. They're impulsive. They're irrational. They're illogical. They can't see the impact of their own choices on their behavior because they can't be self-reflective. They can't evaluate quite often the social interaction and much else around them because they are not self-evaluating. Excuse me. They have a poor ability to recognize and evaluate rewards. This is very common. Now, this is not just for bad behavior that we find annoying. This is the natural way this system works. And you've all experienced it. Imagine you are on a baseball team, and first baseman becomes self-reflective or self-evaluating. Would you want that to happen? In other words, the first baseman in the middle of the game is saying, I wonder if I'm a decent person. Am I making good life choices? Is this my highest and best use? What kind of ball are they going to play that day? No. And again, a lot of our entertainments in our country are really designed to keep the sympathetic system aroused, and for short periods of time, and that's great fun. However, it's not the clear thinking. When they move into that arousal, they're going to experience what? All about right now. They're going to be impulsive. They're going to be irrational. They're going to be illogical. They're not going to be self-reflective. They're not going to be evaluating much of what they're doing, and they're not going to be paying much attention to the rewards. So this is pretty common. When we are in this state, we are not looking at what we are doing or the potential dangers of it. We are just being reactive. Is it unpleasant? Oh yeah, it's really unpleasant. Is it annoying? Oh, of course it is. Behavior. It is not pathology. It's not mental illness. It's not somebody being willfully bad. It is just a biological response to having high levels of arousal in this body. We have got to get to a place where we understand that. Somebody has a history of high ACE scores. They may have a body that is constantly in this state of arousal, and these are the kinds of behaviors you will see from them. And we've got to stop seeing this as bad behavior and instead say, oh, I'm seeing this. It means this person's body is in a state of arousal, and we need to help people get that body out of that state of arousal. We see this all the time when people that are mitigating and using substances. The people around them say, Can't they see how bad this use is? Can't they see the impact on their family? If they really loved their family, they wouldn't be doing these things. Those are all examples of how the person looking at it can't regulate themselves well. They're becoming reactive to the other person's experience and becoming judgmental. It's unhelpful. So for transformation to occur, we can't have people in that aroused sympathetic nervous system, or what I call the Hulk system. What we really need to create permanent change is people being in Bruce Banner mode. We often don't like working with the Hulk. And we're always trying to get the behaviors that Bruce Banner is capable out of the Hulk. However, that's not going to work. The Hulk behaves the way the Hulk behaves. Trying to get rational, calm, self-reflective behavior out of the Hulk is irrational. Our first job always needs to be is help people get into Bruce Banner mode. How do we help somebody get into Bruce Banner mode? So that they can grow and change on purpose. Because as long as they're in the Hulk system, it's a reactive, impulsive, hostile kind of response system. It is not self-reflective, it's not self-evaluating, and it's certainly not evaluating the rewards of one's own behavior or actions. So when the sympathetic system is dominant, the things that are normal to see, these are what you should see. These are the things you should see. Now, I'm not saying that you should look forward to them, because some of them are really kind of unpleasant. But the fact that they are unpleasant does not make them wrong. So what you should see is people that move into that Hulk mode should have real difficulty identifying and expressing themselves verbally. They should have difficulty modulating emotion. They will have difficulty noticing the differences in their own experiences. In other words, creating a distinction that, oh, this isn't really this. That doesn't happen well. They tend to not be very resilient when it comes to what we would consider conscious awareness of resilience, in other words, making choices. They tend to not have good coping strategies. They tend to fail to recognize social cues and to respond to social situations appropriately. You see an increase in high levels of emotional volatility and reactivity. You see a lot of explosive behavior, a lot of what we call unmodulated emotional expressions, and a lot of relational difficulties. These are all part of the package of having someone having had a long, pervasive history of arousal. Now, not everybody that has high ACE scores is going to have this kind of presentation, but a significant number of people in our society that have ACE scores, particularly those that exceed 4 or 5, are going to have these as kind of common attributes. And what we do in society is we see these attributes as the problem rather than the consequence of arousal. And that becomes very problematic. So once you understand what ACE scores impact is, and you understand one of the natural things that should happen is people are not going to be self-reflective. And if they are mitigating, for example, I am creating space through the use of an opiate of some kind, I am not thinking about the impact of that on my system. I am not thinking about the impact of it on my loved ones. I am not thinking about the fact that it's illegal to have these in my possession, or that I have to break the law to get them. I am only thinking about the relief that I may get. And the relief may not be sustained long, but it's not a logical, reasonable activity because the arousal is there. How do we deal with this? We have to get the body in a relaxed and more regulated state. You can't do that by focusing on behaviors, thinking, and emotion. So let me ask you this question for you yourselves, and then I'll move on. When you are in the Hulk mode, let's just think about this for yourself. When you find yourself in the Hulk mode and you're in that state of arousal, do you easily sacrifice control of the situation to somebody else, particularly an authority figure? How often do you believe that somebody else's demands, requests, or the questions that they have about what you're doing are fair or rational or just? You have the ability to sit still and act rationally with logic and reason when you yourself are in Hulk mode. Do you have the ability to be patient and planful and to be intentional in your reactions? Or when you are in Hulk mode yourself, aren't you just reactive? So all human beings do it. All human beings behave in this way when they're in states of arousal. What we're dealing with people that have histories of high A scores is that they are constantly in this state of arousal. And so as long as they're in that state, what you see is biologically correct behavior. And until we can help the body relax, we should see those things.
So just as a review, Dr. Roten has identified the nature of the sympathetic nervous system and that it's immediate, that the individual with this activation, this level of arousal, is not future focused. Actions are impulsive, irrational, even illogical. There's little self-reflection, there is little evaluation, there's just a poor ability to evaluate consequences of behaviors. So sympathetic nervous system, this is again, the system of arousal. It's a survival mechanism, and it's what is activated at times of stress. And change or transformation, as Dr. Roten talked about, requires that calm, like Bruce Banner state of being, rather than the Hulk, the impulsive, over the top, not in good control state of being. So our first effort is always to get people to that place of calm, that Bruce Banner place. And if we don't, again, the ability to reason is not accessible for that individual. That part of the brain is simply not easily accessible. I know when I think about it, working in mental health for my adult career and working with people in crisis much of the time, I can say that I don't want to deliver bad news to anyone or tell people something that I know they don't want to hear when they're in that high state of arousal. I know that if I don't work to help them to that place of calm and connect to them, relate to them, I see that they're engaging with me, I'm getting better eye contact, I can see the muscle tension reducing, then first we can have discussions that they'll be able to look at the situation a little clearer and what actions maybe can be taken. Acting too soon, acting when someone is in Hulk state, in a classroom, for example, might result in a student tossing books across the room, flipping over their desk, doors being slammed. We know this with kids, right? If you're telling kids, well, you don't stop that immediately, you're grounded. They don't stop, we say, now you're grounded for a week. They don't stop, now you're grounded for a month, right? It's where we're trying to reach them and get them to think about the consequences when in fact they just don't have easy access to that part of their brain because of the way that the brain works and what we understand about the sympathetic nervous system. Is this making sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay. Any other thoughts about that or comments about that?
What are the, sorry, brother, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What are the ways that we can, oh, sorry, I'm chewing. What are the ways that we would bring someone out of the Hulk mode into the Bruce Banner mode? How would you make someone more compliant without being domineering or appearing as a tyrannical ruler, and without using manipulation or any of the other measures that we've now identified as unprofitable in a long-term basis?
That is an excellent question. Individuals respond differently, and there are a lot of strategies for de-escalation. One of the key strategies are, first of all, listening, helping to give people choices, giving them space, giving them time, and letting them feel empowered rather than as if someone else is now going to just take over all controls. So again, depends on the situation, depends on the environment, depends on the individual. Getting to know the individual beforehand and having a discussion with someone in advance as to what are the things that calm you when you're upset. And how do you know when you're beginning to get upset? So we can sometimes catch people as they're just beginning to escalate or get into that state of dysregulation. We catch it early enough, then maybe the calm can come a little bit sooner. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Okay.
You mentioned listen and give them time and space. Are there any other suggestions?
Again, it depends on what your situation is. If you're in a classroom, if you're in a household, situation, allowing kids to that time to cool down. And very often, you know what they'll do, they'll go in their room, they'll turn up the music. Sometimes they'll keep their hands busy doing something, shooting a basketball. Often when you can engage both sides of the brain and doing physical activities involving rhythm and movement can be very helpful. But always when kids are upset, you want to be checking on them also to see that they're okay, rather than just leaving them for hours, right, to calm. You want to be seeing that they're okay, but giving them that space and letting them know that you're there for support, not presenting as something or someone for them to be afraid of, or that you're going to come down hard with the discipline. But that engaging as a caring person, as a predictable person, they know and they can expect how you will behave, that you behave consistently in a calm, deliberate, caring kind of manner. Those are all things that help as well.
And once you get somebody in that Bruce Banner mode, there's times when I'll actually work with somebody to replay a situation as far as let's go through the motions again of the steps I would take, or to actually have them back up and redo what just happened. Only this time they're gonna work on a different choice and come up with their different options. So in the future, they have those options in front of them, and they start to. And they may not do any of those options. However, at least they're aware now of the next time. So that gives you building more and more of a tool set with them, where eventually that will kick in. And it may be a couple years down the road. That's one of the things I found out. However, it will eventually kick in.
Very good. And I know you made reference to this, that what you don't want to do, right, is to be intimidating or domineering, that kind of thing. Sometimes the effect of that, of again, being intimidating and coming on strong with power, we can initially get some cooperation and they can be compliant, but that that does not mean that we're behaving in the most effective way, because in effect, what they may be doing simply is shutting down, even dissociating. And so that then can be actually re-traumatizing for someone who's experienced trauma in their life. And yes, they're complying, and yes, they're cooperating now, but what has it done to the relationship, and how has it really helped them? It ends up interfering quite a bit. So again, that calm, focused on being consistently seen as a figure of support. Sometimes consequences do get involved, but very important that those happen later and that there's discussion about those rather than just boom, you know, this is what I'm going to do to you as a result of what you did. More of a discussion and even a collaboration, you know, what's going to help in the future. Making sense still?
Yeah, definitely. I've had a similar altercation with someone where coming on strong has resulted in, you know, intimidation and threatening behavior coming from the client, let's say. And this is usually, obviously, when you're trying to reason with someone who's unreasonable. So the best, what would you say the best response would be in that environment? If they believe that you're being manipulative when you're calm, has that gotten to a stage where there is no recourse?
Well, arguing doesn't work if someone is not in the place of being able to reason. So whether you are presenting yourself in a calm and reasonable way, if they're not able to think things through clearly, then they simply need more time to get to that place of calm where they can see both sides and do the reasoning. Sometimes it doesn't happen as fast as we would like it to, but that's the situation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Trust the process.
Right, right.
So in this segment, I want to talk about how trauma gets created, or another way of looking at this, how does the body get pushed to the point where it has to adapt or mitigate? And this becomes kind of an important piece for us to understand. So every single one of us have a range of tolerance, or a range of adaptability, if you will. And as long as we stay within that range, we are considered to be pretty resilient. The problem is that the number one influence on the range of tolerance happens to be the state of the body. So when the state of the body changes, so does our range of tolerance, which means for us human beings, our state of tolerance, or our range of tolerance, is constantly fluctuating all day long. I get up in the morning, I've had a nice rest, I have a nice relaxing morning, no real rush. I get to the office, there's been 2 crises and, you know, and a fire in the next building, and now now tension is raised in my body. I'm getting a change in chemical structure in my body, change in hormonal structure in my body, and now my range of tolerance has just been affected. Another way of looking at this, think about if you have ever had a newborn in your house that didn't sleep very well the first few weeks that they were born. How many days did you go with relatively poor sleep before you noticed you were a little bit more cranky and irritable with other people? You didn't mean to be, but your range of tolerance was affected by the state of your body. We often think that the state of this range of tolerance is relatively fixed, and that's just not true. It's always in a state of fluctuation. And what we're doing to this is dumping all sorts of hormones and chemicals into it. I call it the fiery cocktail. Now, the fiery cocktail is composed of a number of things, of course, adrenaline and cortisol and noradrenaline and, you know, catecholamine, and I mean, there's just a whole bunch of things that are in that fiery cocktail. And as we get a dose of fiery cocktail in our system, it charges our system up. In other words, it excites our system, and it moves us towards the upper range of our threshold. And as we move towards that threshold, the system we're moving into is our Hulk system. Again, as we move to the threshold and beyond, we're moving into our Hulk system. And the body will naturally look for ways to reduce that arousal to get back in balance, and it will use what we call reactive adaptions and reactive mitigations to do that. In other words, these are things that are automatic responses to try to bring the arousal down. One of the challenges we face with that is that people don't realize that you get a dose of this stuff, you get a dose of the fiery cocktail, and it's changed your body, it's changed your chemistry, it's changed your hormonal mix at the time, and it has to metabolize before you get back down to baseline. So I have something happen, and in a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes, I may be able to talk rationally about it and actually begin to think more clearly, but my body is still in an aroused state until it's metabolizing this stuff. So, and you've all experienced this. How many of you have had something that happens quite often, no big deal, but today you blew up about it? Why? Because you have enough of this stuff in your system that even though no one single thing has pushed you that far, just the simple amount of this in your system has put you at the place where you're almost at threshold, and the next little thing that happens pushes you right above threshold. That is a biological function of this. Now, the range for human, for the human metabolism to be able to absorb this stuff and get you back down to what is considered a baseline is kind of lengthy. On the short side, it could be a few hours. On the upper end of that, it can be as many as 30 hours. So what you're really looking at is this incredibly big window. The more arousal we have in our life, the longer it takes our body to metabolize it. It has to do with the arousal happens and our body begins to try to push it back down. But if the arousal keeps happening all day long, the body is slower to metabolize it because it's too much work to bring it down just to have it come back up. And so what you end up with is people that have a lot of trauma, adversity, traumatic experiences in their life tend to, takes them longer for their body to metabolize this stuff than somebody else that lives a relatively optimal life. Let me give you another example, and I'm only going to look at this as for two different chemicals in the body, cortisol and adrenaline. As the cortisol level goes up in your system, your ability to use your hippocampus gets suppressed. And why is the hippocampus important? Hippocampus is the great integrator of all the parts of the brain. In other words, all these different parts are going on and they all work really well, but if you want them to work in a collaborative, integrated way, you need the hippocampus to be there and functioning. Well, what happens is when we increase cortisol, we essentially pull this apart, which means it affects our executive functioning. It affects our ability to create sequential memories. It affects our ability to see differences in things or do what we call reality checking. It makes it difficult for them to have impulse control. Why? Because as the cortisol level goes up, the part of the brain that is in charge of stopping it, or the impulse control center, is actually suppressed. So as the cortisol level goes up, your ability to have impulse control goes down. Very practical understanding of that. So what will charge up cortisol is anything that is any chaotic environment will, any aggressive environment will, any punitive environment will, any highly unstable environment, or any environment that has a lot of instability to it will certainly charge up cortisol. In addition to that, then you have, real acts of aggression, which would be all of the, when you start looking at the ACE scores, what we're looking at, ACE scores, high ACE scores is like a recipe for keeping cortisol high in your system, which means you're going to have difficulty doing these kinds of things that are put to sleep or suppressed when cortisol is high. Now, on adrenaline, on the other hand, as adrenaline levels go up, emotional memory goes up, sensory memory goes up, but sequential memory and context goes down. We also are going to experience more reactive emotions like fear and anxiety and phobias. You're going to have a difficulty focusing. You're going to have difficulty with sleep. You're going to have difficulty following goals that you have through effort to attainment, as part of what happens when we have increases in adrenaline in our system. So these are two of the about 30 elements in the fiery cocktail. If these two have such a detrimental effect on our ability to think clearly, we have to become more sensitive to understanding. If we have people that have histories of opioid use, we have to understand that there's a good chance that they have pretty high levels of these in their system. And again, we really need to focus on, it's not just getting them to be sober. It's not just getting them not to use. It is, we have to get the arousal that is keeping them in this cycle of behavior reduced. In other words, how do we help them feel safe? How do we help them feel connected to somebody? How do we help them have the ability to calm this system down? And most programs are not looking at that. We're not advocating for that. But one of the great discoveries about the ACE study, it really being the first social determinant of health that we know of, is that it really helps us understand why it's necessary to go for helping people regulate and get this package of our biology in shape before we tackle behavior, emotion, and thinking. So what we really want is for the whole brain to work together, for us to have access to being able to create distinctions in our experience, to be able to reality check, to be able to modify and regulate the amygdala system. We want to be able to create good sequential serialized memory and context. We want to be able to connect the different regions of the brain together well. We want to increase our ability to be effective in executive functioning. We want to be able to inhibit our impulse control or the impulsive behaviors that we have. We want to be able to be more logical and reasonable. We need hippocampal function to do that. We need that integrated brain and nervous system. We do not have access to that integrated brain and nervous system when our body's in a state of arousal. How often we are putting people in treatment and we're trying to get them to behave in logical ways and reasonable ways when they are still actively in the Hulk mode. And think about, I had somebody tell me, well, in the last movie, the Hulk is reason and logic. And I don't know because I haven't seen it, but I'm going to suggest to you that what we're really, that's fine. I'm using this as a metaphor. An active Hulk is not going to be logical and reasonable. So I hope that makes some sense. So why is this important to us to really understand? We cannot effectively reduce substance use or compulsive behaviors if we cannot help someone to get into and stay in Bruce Banner brain. Living a well-regulated life ourselves is necessary. We who are helpers must be living well-regulated lives, because otherwise we're going to become reactive to them. We have to invite others to do the same. We have to design all programming, all of our initiatives to really help create environments that have little provocation in them, that help people calm down, stay calm, and stay in that Bruce Banner mode.
So how does trauma get created, or how does the body get pushed to the point that it must adapt or mitigate? Again, it's not any specific trauma, it's It's whatever puts an individual in a state of stress and activates that sympathetic nervous system. Stress that is unpredictable, severe, that we have little or no control over is the type of stress then that keeps our bodies in alert state, and this perception that danger is right around the corner. You don't know when it's going to happen or what's going to happen. So this, on an ongoing basis, as we've said now many times, this then is prolonged toxic stress. And all of us, every human being on the planet, has a range of tolerance. Some days we have a little more tolerance than other days. People with histories of adversity and toxic stress tend to have narrower ranges of tolerance. But as long as we can stay in our range of tolerance, some people call this the zone of resilience. If we stay in here most of the time, then we can have greater health, our ability to problem solve much more effective, and in general, just happier, more resilient. When though, as he talked about the fiery cocktail, so you add stress to the situation, whatever that situation is, and as stress is added, at what point does our system become then overwhelmed? And then we need to adapt and mitigate. So for some individuals, again, with that zone of tolerance, zone of resilience being more narrow, it doesn't take nearly as much. And I imagine you have all seen that. So this slide is showing now the upper range of tolerance. So again, when our systems become overwhelmed and we're pushed to adapt or mitigate, right? You might see the Hulk type thing. You might see someone who is withdrawn, depressed, disconnecting, dissociating. You might see someone just even quietly bubbling. And this is where, again, we expect to see much more substance use when someone is often in this overwhelmed place. And this is a review of really just two of the chemicals in the body that have wonderful function when they are in proper amounts with proper frequency. But when they become problematic and when the system is activated and these chemicals are in the body too often in too large amounts, with the cortisol, we see again reducing the hippocampal activity. I have another slide that really details what that part of the brain is doing. Reducing the high level functioning of the brain, the reasoning, thinking part of the brain, affects memories, affects our reality checking. It's restricting access to our impulse control, so impulsivity becomes a problem. An interesting and disturbing thing that research has found is that cortisol actually damages brain tissue. It actually damages brain tissue when there is too much of it too often. Now, adrenaline, again, in excess, it increases emotional and sensory memory, which becomes involved when we talk about people having past traumas being triggered for them. Maybe something that they smell or something reminding them of a situation, that those memories are particularly strong. Adrenaline increases fear, anxiety, even hallucinations, depression, and agitation. It can reduce our ability to focus in, to sleep well, problem solving, being goal focused. Those are all things that can, again, become problem. And the hippocampal function, the hippocampus, again, just generally, it is vital to our learning and our memory. It directs many bodily functions. It plays an important role in our behavior. It works with and interacts with the amygdala, which is the processing of emotions. So very, very important part of the brain. Dr. Roten mentioned that a single dose of the fiery cocktail, regardless of dose size, may take hours to metabolize. So in other words, our body's chemical response and then the changes in chemicals in the bloodstream, in the brain tissue, these things all take time, sometimes hours, before they resolve and normal levels actually return within the body. So people vary with the amount of time that it takes for that to settle down. But if it's a system that gets activated often, then it tends to take a much longer time, again, for the system to sort of settle down. So why this is important? We cannot effectively reduce substance use or compulsive behaviors if we cannot help people to get into and stay in calm Bruce Banner mode, part of the brain. Living well, regulated lives ourselves, inviting others to do the same, designing all our interactions to help people become and stay regulated the majority of the time. This is what the point really is. And this is our last video with Dr. Roten here for concepts 13 to 15.
So the last piece I want to cover
We'll give it a minute to load, but Dr. Roten is going to be talking about trauma, not about the bad and horrible events of someone's life. It's about prolonged and or repeated arousal of the body. That adaptation and mitigation are normal processes common to all human beings. And when people have histories of toxic stress, adversity, and trauma, they're likely to act out, which is an adaptation, or to make space to mitigate or lessen the effects. And these are absolutely biologically correct behaviors with overwhelmed systems. I think we may not have access to this last video, two, there is more to be learned. Certainly the brain in all its complexities, there's a great deal to be learned, but threat and stress response system of the body, understanding the polyvagal system and the anterior circulate of the cortex. If you're someone who is very into studying the brain, these might be some things you'd pursue. So polyvagal system, really addressing how the brain connects with the nervous system to affect changes in the body. Heart rate, respiratory rate, there's communication that goes back and forth to both arouse and to calm those systems. And the body's radar system, the anterior cingulate of the cortex, there's an active relevancy system that is totally individualized based on one's own history. And arousal impacts then the relevancy process. Those things that activate arousal create attentional competition based on relevance. So if this anterior circulate of the cortex has been activated too often or stayed on too long, then we can see some of these things that Dr. Roten addresses. Rigid black and white thinking, sometimes thought of as irrational beliefs. People having strong beliefs that are not open to change. Many negative internal dialogues, overly negative memories. People being overly focused on finding pain, hurt, disappointment, negativity. I imagine you can think of some people that you've encountered in your life that were this kind of, sounds familiar. No tolerance for delayed gratification, everything needing to be immediate or seeming to need immediacy for them. Poor ability to really orient to the future, being impulsive and not rational, not thinking things logically through. Little, if any, consistent self-reflection or evaluation of the self. Just because something is relevant to you doesn't make it relevant to others. So really important to keep in mind this individuality, and that we can't know immediately what someone's past has been and how it will affect their perception of things. Many of those drawn to use substances and engage in compulsive behaviors spend most of their day, every day, as if being trapped in different pictures of rattlesnakes. So with that high level of arousal, and threat is right around the corner. You never know when it's going to happen. Toxic stress is what we're talking about. And until we can help them resolve that, the use issues are often secondary, because they are very naturally going to be seeking ways to feel better. So this is my last slide. We'll have discussion yet in a few slides, but just some overall summary kinds of things to leave you with. You know, what will you possibly have to change about you in order to use some of these concepts for yourself, for your work, in your interactions with people in the community? What are the concepts that you can immediately put into practice as you advocate for education, which we're doing right now, system change and treatment for opioids and other compulsive behaviors? How does any of this change how you see and understand opiate use, as well as other compulsive behaviors? So just some thoughts to leave you with. And Larry, if you can pick up on these last few slides, then we'll follow with some open discussion.
Okay. One of the things we are available for the coalition to work with businesses, schools, churches, community organizations, smaller groups. We do the adverse childhood experience awareness in that module to find it, so people start to realize how it impacts all phases of life, especially when it's changed and altered the brain development in many of the youth. The other part is we do a lot around opioids and other drugs as far as presentations. When people understand opioids, it's a whole new world. They get it real quick with that presentation. Understanding vaping, marijuana, alcohol, whether it's adult or it's teen use, and how that impacts the brain as far as the development, especially with teens. And so that's my number one reason why teens shouldn't use: brain development, period, bottom line. We also have this available in English and Spanish. And then you're going to have to move that forward. Okay, got it. So it's a movement. Join the movement. It's good. Get in the way of underage drinking, teen drug use, opioid use, RX abuse, and we're good. So Gail.
And you're always looking for people to join your coalition, right?
Mm-hmm.
People are always welcome there. Okay. So any questions at this point? I know there was lots of repetition, but some of the concepts can be pretty new to people.
Where would I be able to find other resources like this? Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead. Say again, I'm sorry.
Where would I be able to find other resources like this besides your website? Is there any books that you would recommend personally as a
Wonderful.
PhD student? Oh, sorry.
Absolutely. So the Arizona ACEs Consortium has a website with lots of resources. They have online education and a multitude of resources.
And
so
those links are actually in the handout. So the PDF file that was sent, if you have that, right at the second last page or the last page has actually live links on a lot of resources, including the ACEs Consortium, where you'll be able to go to there. And then there's you find a lot of very, very good information there too.
ACEs Connection, the National Child Trauma Institute, but all of those will be listed resources at that site.